Rav Shua, I just want to introduce you and say that we had you here at YCT just a couple of days ago. I know your mom is on, so we're going to say hi to her as well. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have you with us in community and as a fellow Rav, thinking about the future of Am Yisrael in profound and important ways. You are, of course, the director of family learning at Beth Jacob Congregation in Oakland, California, originally from right here in West Hempstead, New York. You're a Wexner Graduate Fellow, received rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University, and you spent many, many years doing many, many important things, bringing you to the point where now you are one of the members of the clergy of this shul in Oakland. And I just want to thank you, as I said, for being a fellow rabbi, a fellow traveler, and a friend who is a master of teaching text. And so we have you with us right now. We have about half an hour or so, and I'm going to ask you your topic tonight, Lessons of Hope in Darkness, the Volozhin Yeshiva's Seder. I'm wondering how this will be similar or different to Rabbi Rafael Daluya, who's coming up soon, thinking about the Moroccan Seder. But why don't you take us away? And again, just let us know how you would like questions. Would you like people to wait till the end if they have questions to put them into the chat? Would you like them to be brought to you by me throughout? What works for you? And then you can take it away from here. We have about half an hour.
That's fair. We can send things through the chat. I'll see if I will get distracted. We'll try to leave the last 5 minutes for questions as well. So if it's a point of clarification, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll leave 5 minutes at the end for continuing the conversation.
And just a reminder, if people would like to take advantage of the closed captions or ASL interpretation, just look at the bottom of your screens and press those buttons. Rav Shua, we're all yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's an incredible honor to be here. I'm so excited to be learning Torah and to be thinking about the Seder already. I hope I'll be able to offer certain ideas of hope from the Netziv, and we'll get there in just a moment. So B'chod Rabbanim, and also the fact that Imi Marasi, my mother's also here. I'd like to share a bit about how the Seder goes at my house, which is my father feels that Pesach is incomplete unless we have done some amount of review over the Netziv's Haggadah. The Netziv is Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He is the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin of the 1800s. And he has, I think, and my take on his Haggadah is that it is filled, and he reads the entire night as being filled with unbridled optimism. And so we're going to go through that in a moment. I'll actually start by sharing a certain amount of excitement about what's happening today and what we're learning now is that Netziv feels that anyone who's in this Zoom room right now is worthy of praise, because he understands that our Haggadah, when it describes that Kol Marba L'Saper B'Tzias Mitzrayim Hareza Meshubach, that it says at the end of Avadim Hayinu, that anyone who continues and adds more to the telling of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, they are praiseworthy. Now, something to get ready for the rest of today is that the Netziv is going to use a lot of halachic terminology. He's going to use different laws and kind of the minutia of Jewish text to then try to get broader feelings around this. So one thing he points out is that there is a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva about how much of the night of the Seder nights needs to be dedicated to the Pesach and therefore the telling of the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim. And according to Rabbi Kiva, you need to be speaking the entire night, because you can have the Karm Pesach the entire night. And so if the entire night is something that is fitting for the telling of a Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, how could one extend and say extra amount of storytelling on the night of Pesach if you might be required to speak the entire night according to one Mechilta? And so the Netziv describes that the way that you can actually expand your storytelling on the night of Pesach is the more preparation you do beforehand. Right, so if you do preparation beforehand, that means that the studying and the learning that you're doing on that night will have a greater effect and will have greater impact. So anyone who studies about the Haggadah before the night of the Seder, they are the ones who are praiseworthy. So therefore, anyone who's here, we've already had a wonderful start for our Seder night, according to the Netziv. The second thing in that exact same paragraph of Avadim Hayinu describes that even if we all knew everything about the story, we've learned so much, still, mitzvah aleinu l'saper Yitzias Mitzrayim, it would still be important for us to tell this story. And for the Netziv to describe, because this is an action and an activity that's not just about knowledge. Rather, it is to sharpen and it is to strengthen our belief and emunah, especially in that God controls the world. And so that's our mission for this class, and that's our mission for the Seder, is that it's going to help us understand our belief in Kadosh Baruch Hu and belief in God as we understand the Haggadah itself. So let's back up to describe the Nitziv's introduction. He says overall, when he has a perspective of the Seder night, there are trends. And the trends of the halacha of the Seder night is balancing two things. One, we want to keep as much as possible to have the customs just like we might have done the Seder if we were in Eretz Yisrael and if we have the Karban Pesach in front of us right now. And we want to balance that with a similar idea that, that matzah is really our focus today. So we want to balance that matzah is the main center of our Haggadah today with practices of what would have been like if we were having a Karban Pesach in Eretz Yisrael. Let me give you a few of his examples. So first, actually, I'm going to skip to, in my mind, I'm going to skip to some of the simpler ones. He wants you to pretend like you are in Eretz Yisrael and as if you're surrounded by a Karban Pesach in the following ways. So for instance, we have a bunch of washings of our hands that happens that night. And one of them, especially the one before Marar, is a practice that if you would be dipping certain vegetables that you would need to wash your hands beforehand. That is an outdated practice that has no halachic relevance today. But it did have relevance back in Eretz Yisrael, back during the times that we would be caring about Tumah and Tahara. And so on this night, we do Netilas Yadayim just as if it was the world in which Tumah and Tahara and our Karbanot were still existing. Similarly, he asks, why does one wear a kittel on this night? People have a practice of wearing this nice white robe that they wear to a Passover Seder, especially the ones who are leading it, or those who are married might have this practice. And where does this idea of the kittel come from? It's something that people really struggle with, and it's hard to define and understand. It might be somehow remembering the day of your death because people are buried in it, which is a rather somber and kind of jarring out of nowhere understanding of why we have this. But the Netziv describes that when you'd be having kudshim, when you would be eating a karban or kudshim kalim, it's like you're eating from a shulchan gavoa. It's like you're eating from God's table. And the Pesukim described that when you're doing that, you should v'yilbash otana bigdei sheish, you should wear linen garments. And perhaps that the reason why we wear a kittel is actually because we are as if we were eating karbanos right now. And similarly, that's why we have a split in the middle of Hallel. He argues that Hallel has a bit before Magid and a bit after Magid because, a bit before and after our eating, because the eating itself is a mitzvah. It's not a hefsek, it's not something that interrupts your Hallel, but it's actually our eating of matzah and our eating of that entire meal is just like the mitzvahs of eating karbanos. And basically the entire structure of the night and how we're dressing and how we're acting is as if karbanot exist and as if we are currently ready or preparing that maybe next year we can be bringing these karbanot in Eretz Yisrael. That, however, is tempered with another focus specifically on matzah. Now, what does he mean by this? And again, this is when we're going to have to get ready for the fact that the Netziv and the Rosh Yeshiva Volozhin is going to get into some minutia of halacha to get a general sense. And he takes us from two separate subjects. Subject number one, and both of them are going to be focusing on the afikomen. There's two halachic disagreements about the afikomen. One is, when should you have the afikomen? Could you have it after chatzos, after the middle of the night? The second question we have about the afikomen is what happens if you happen to have fallen asleep in the middle of the Seder and you interrupted from when you started and had some matzah until later. Could you still count? Can you still have the afikomen later? Or do you have to assume that your Seder's over once you fall asleep in some form? So the machlok for the first one, can you have the matzah after chatzos? There's a machlokas of Rishonim that Tosfos describes that you could have it after chatzos. It's best, however, to have it before chatzos. One, because as we described earlier, there's a machlokas between two different Tanaim about whether or not you'd have the Karban Pesach for only half the night or the full amount of night. And according to Tosfos, we should have the perspective that it is the whole night. But just like with a lot of mitzvos, a lot of commandments that we have all night, we really try to do it before midnight. So for instance, all of Shas begins with the first Mishnah in Brachos, about when should we recite Kriyat Shema. You technically have all night, but we'd rather you set it before chatzos. And so rabbinically, we try to make sure it happens before chatzos, but if you need, you can have it the rest of the night. And that's how Tosfos understands, and basically is trying to expand that when you're going to have the afikomen, which is now our best way of having our Seder, we want to give you all night that we can to make sure to have that matzah. Rambam, however, believes that after chatzos, you cannot touch that matzah. Why can't you touch that matzah? Because matzah is in place of the Karban Pesach. Karban Pesach, you cannot have after chatzos, not just because we'd rather you have it before chatzos, but because if you end up having a bit of the Karban the next morning, there is a chi of kares. There's one of the greatest punishments one can get of a grave sin of if you accidentally have the Karban Pesach the next morning after the night has passed. And to make sure that no one gets close to that, we have cut off eating the Karban Pesach as at chatzos. So the Rambam, because he wants matzah to be just like the laws of Pesach, he won't let you have the afikomen after chatzos. Tosfos, because he is so excited about the mitzvah of a matzah, he says that, of course, we can have it all night. We'd rather about chatzos, but we wouldn't let that ruin our night. Make sure to have it before the next morning. You'll see similarly, they have a similar approach about sleeping before the afikomen. Now, according to the Rambam, we're going to have another strict approach, which is that it's aser. That once, if you've had your Seder and then you've fallen asleep, you can no longer have an afikomen. Partly because we know the rule that after what we tell as we tell the Chacham about his question about the rules, that after you kind of have to end the night with this matzah. And if you've fallen asleep, it's now an end to your Seder, and you shouldn't be eating anymore after that point. And so, and partly because this has to do specifically with the laws of karbanos, which is, when you would have a Karban Pesach, you would have to eat it in a designated location with designated people. And that would be one Seder. And if you fell asleep, it's almost as if you've now traveled to a second Seder. And so because of the Rambam, because he's so stuck of thinking of matzah as a replacement for the Karban Pesach, is going to be strict again around the afikomen. That he's going to say that, and partly because he also believes that of the two parts of matzah, there's the first time where we have our matzah and we're yotze the mitzvah of matzah. And then at the end, when we have the afikomen, which is kind of the dessert in the second half of matzah. According to Maimonides, that first part is the real part of the Seder. It's like you're really starting to have your Karban Pesach. And therefore, if you fall asleep, your Seder is over, you can't start a second Seder, and your night is finished. But according to Tosfos, he understands it that it's not a hefsek. And even though, yes, the rules that you would have around a Karban would be kind of in our way, the afikomen, however, for him is, for them, is the really ikr of the mitzvah, but really the second part of the Seder, and the ending is really the most important part. So really what they're all doing is, according to Tosfos and the Rambam, they're bending these laws just a bit in that they want the matzah to be as much like a Karban Pesach. However, unless it's going to kind of overrule the amount of matzah you're having. So Tosfos would want to make sure you can keep on having matzah, and you'd want to make sure to have it after. So even if it gets closer to after chatzos, even if you've had a hefsek, he'd still want you to have that matzah. But according to Rambam, he has all the strictness that really is not relevant to matzah. It's really only relevant to the Karban Pesach. So then I want to describe what are we getting at about why he's having that focus? Why would that matter? So for this, I'm going to look at one of the first paragraphs that we get once we begin Magid. I think if I could, I'm going to share a source sheet. I'm going to share my screen, but in case that's unavailable, I've shared this link. I'm hoping this link works. If anyone give me a thumbs up if you can see it there, but I'm going to share my screen and we're going to look at Halach Ma'ani together for just a moment.
The link works for anyone who wants to click on it in the chat, and we'll also share it with people afterwards. And you're getting thumbs up from Michael Chernick coming to us from Vermont as well.
Perfect.
Okay.
So let's get to Halach Ma'anya and how we often start the Seder. So Halach Ma'anya diachalu avasana be'arad Mitzrayim. That this is the bread, and we're going to have to understand what is Anya here, that our grandparents ate in Mitzrayim, and kol tichvin yesev yechol, kol titzrich yesev yivsach. All who need, come and eat, and all who need, let's have a carbon Pesach. Let's do Pesach together. Now we're doing this here, L'shana haba ba'aretz Yisrael, but in the future we will do this in Eretz Yisrael. Hashta avdei L'shana haba b'nei chorin. Now we are servants, but in the future we're going to be free. Now this paragraph is really troubling. One, the fact that it's written in Aramaic, people understand this, that this was written when we were in Galus, and this is a exile paragraph. This is a way that we look at it only when we're in exile, which is funny that also the line says, anyone who needs, let's go and have a carbon Pesach together. Because presumably, the invention of this paragraph was when there wasn't going to be a carbon at the same time. And people struggle with how to understand that phrase. Now, according to the Netziv, he assumes that Vayifsach just means, right, the matzah kind of replaces Pesach in some form. But there are other Pirushim that describe that maybe what we're doing is we're inviting you for next year. That we're actually so certain that next year we're going to bring a carbon Pesach, that we're kind of getting reservations now. I used to misunderstand a different translation of a Pirush HaKadmon that maybe I thought described that maybe tonight we are going to all come to Eretz Yisrael somehow, and we're saying this at the beginning of the Seder, that maybe miraculously we'll all be transported to the land and bring the carbon Pesach of that very night. Although that also doesn't work halachically because you have to bring the carbon Pesach before Yantiv begins. Although there's also a mission that seems to imply that maybe we can do it all week. Either way, it seems to be that we might be inviting for right now, we can really do have a carbon Pesach. But let's focus on this halach ma'anya for a moment. What does this mean about this type of bread? This is the bread that seems to be it could be of anios, it could be of something of poverty. And this is something that we had when we were poor. And when were we poor? We were poor when we were ourselves in Egypt. So realizing the matzah that we're having is the matzah that we had when we were in Egypt. We would not necessarily refer to matzah in this way when we're in the land of Israel. Because when we're in the land of Israel, actually, matzah appears in a great deal of different karbanos. And so really, you would have had a great deal of respect for it, and you wouldn't have referred to it as lach ma'anya in that form if you were having it as carbon. That phrase is really a phrase of having it in Galus. And that actually leads to a fascinating conversation about how exactly we have our matzah today compared to the different styles. There's really three types of Sedarim in history. There is the Seder that happened on the last night of the Jews being in Egypt, which was right before the morning of them getting redeemed. There's the Seder that they would have had when they're in the land of Israel, while they're bringing Karban Pesach. And then there's the Seder we have nowadays while we are in an exile. And according to the Netziv, we actually purposely pattern how we do our mitzvah this night, not like how we would have a Karban Pesach and how we used to do it in Eretz Yisrael, but rather we specifically do it to mimic exactly how this was done in Mitzrayim on that last night. That has to do with a fascinating way of reading, and machlokas, we understand part of this, our hints to this, is we know that there's one step in the Haggadah called Korech, of where we kind of eat all the things together. And we know that that is Zecher Lemikdash Kehillel, that when we did have a Mikdash, Hillel said you should do this wonderful thing where you put your Pesach and your matzah and your mar together in some form, but the Rabbanan always made sure that you did it separately. Part of that had to do with how they read these following psukim. About Bechodesh Hasheni, this is source number 5 on our sheets, that Ba'arba Asar Yom Bein Harbaim Yasu So Al Matzos Umararim Yachluhu. It describes that you would do this karban, and you'd have that on matzah and mararim. According to Hillel, that actually tells us that you need to have those three things together. According to the Chachamim, they disagree, and they think it really has to do with that disagreement that they have about whether or not mitzvah or mevatlos zu et zu. According to Hillel, in general, different globally, if you ever do a bunch of commandments together, they can't kind of discredit each other, and you can kind of bundle them together and do all mitzvahs all together at the same time if you need it. And therefore, this verse is coming to tell us that you actually need to purposely have the Pesach and the matzah and the mar all in one.
Quick time check. We have 15 minutes to go.
Say again?
15 minutes to go.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Right, so what we're seeing there, according to Hillel, that's actually telling us that we should dafka specifically have the three of them together. According to the Chachamim, globally, they believe you can't put mitzvahs together. They would be mevatel zu et zu. And then your d'oraisa levels of commandments, such as eating the Karban Pesach or having matzah during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, versus the Rabbanan commandments of having different maror during that time. that they would be mevatel zu et zu. So here comes a verse that tells us if you needed to, if you did have them together, it would be allowed. So they have a disagreement about the verse in Bamidbar, which is about how we would do the Korban Pesach for centuries. But they don't agree according to but everyone agrees according to the Netziv that when they were in Mitzrayim, as recorded in Exodus 12:8, that the Seder in Mitzrayim, they ate these things separately. And it has to do with the reading the verse as follows. The v'achlu es habasar b'layla hazeh tzli eish describes that you would have the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach had to be roasted. And that was eaten by itself. And then it says umatzos, and then there's also matzah you should have. And those two things, which are going to be separate, al marorim yachluhu. Those two things separately will also be had on the night that you have marar. And therefore, those three things need to be eaten separately. Now, why should that matter? Why does he go through this long anticipation? Mostly because he wants to describe as follows. When we're in Eretz Yisrael, we have a focus on the Korban Pesach. And when we're in Galus, we have a focus on the matzah. Why does this matter? The Pesach is supposed to remind us about the miracles that happened in Egypt, and we can always remember those nice and happy things. And when you're in the land of Israel, remembering nice, cool things from our history is wonderful to have. And that's the focus of Pesach. You can focus on Asher Pesach, that God kind of took care of us and he passed over, as people like to describe it. But now we are in a place where we actually need to focus on the matzah. Why do we need to focus on matzah? Because matzah has a very specific task. We have matzah to remind us that we need to have it because b'chipazon yatsu, that we left with a good amount of hurry. What we see about matzah is that incredibly unexpectedly, when you don't think you're going to have the time, you're going to rush out and redemption comes faster than expected. It's going to be so quick, you couldn't even get your matzah together in some form. Now, I realize what's fascinating about that is the Jews were originally told to make matzah 2 weeks before they had to have the Seder night and they were going to leave. So they had a 2-week plan to then have matzah on this night. I understand how they could have had matzah on the next day after they had left, but really they purposely, while they're still in Egypt, before they even had to leave, they purposely had matzah. Partly because maybe they always had matzah because they never had time to let their bread rise, but actually because that night, having that matzah was an act of faith. And why it's very often in Kabbalistic phrases, it's often referred to as the bread of faith. Because what they're having is, while they're in Egypt, while they have never seen freedom, they are having a piece of bread to tell them that redemption is going to come so immediately, so swiftly, they would never have time to prepare, and to surprise them that they will be free in the morning. They haven't been free for centuries, but for that one night, they're going to focus on matzah, assuming that they might be free that next day. Now, that's quite a fascinating version of this, which is, and the reason why we need to be focusing on this night, why we need to pretend like we are as if we are in Eretz Yisrael, we are basically practicing in every way we can to understand that the Beit HaMikdash will return. We will need to know the practice about washing our hands. We need to know what it's like to dress as if we were having a korban. And at this point in time, we purposely make sure to pattern our Seder, both with the practices as if we're going to be in Eretz Yisrael next year, and with the feeling of what happens when we were in Egypt itself, which is that tomorrow morning we are going to be redeemed. So the matzah, according to the Netziv, and our focus every Seder night, every single year, is that when we have this matzah, is not just to think, right, when we describe that each person is chayiv, they have to see themselves as if they are the ones who are leaving Egypt. It's not just simply that to remember and feel like it's just so familiar to you, as if you were the one who had left Egypt, but rather the same way that the people in Egypt the next morning kind of wouldn't have been able to expect it, would not have thought that geula, that redemption was going to come so hastily. And it's so hard to expect, and we wouldn't expect it. When it's in that darkest moment, to have that matzah and think tomorrow morning we might be redeemed. To share just a bit more about how he then goes through and reads through a great deal of the paragraphs, let's go through some of the beginning of Magid, which is we begin with Avadim Hayinu, that we ask the 4 questions, and once we get the 4 questions, we ask, why is tonight different than all other nights? And we describe that Avadim Hayinu the Param Mitzrayim, that we were once slaves to Paro. V'yotzienu Hashem Elokeinu misham biyad chazaka, and God took us out with a strong hand, ubezroa netuya, and with an outstretched arm. Now, that phrase is a little odd. The reason why that phrase is odd is because we actually have that verse almost exactly in Devarim. In Devarim, we have the phrase in 621, source number 3, that v'marta levincha, that when your son asks you these, when your children ask you these questions, you should respond to them, avadim hayinu lepara b'mitzrayim, yotzienu Hashem mitzrayim, biyad chazaka, end of verse. But if you look in our Haggadah, we add ubezroa netuya, with an outstretched arm. Now, if you read a lot of Exodus, you'll notice that we often talk about God as both having a strong hand and an outstretched arm. But why, at this moment, do we change the verse and add this praise? It's especially odd because we have a rule about how we function around the Seder night, which is we start off Matcha Beganus, we start with how hard thing was, V'masayim b'shavach, and we end with praise. But for some reason, the Haggadah is going out of its way to add a praise during the complaining part. Right? We're supposed to be complaining now, and for some reason, in the middle of the complaining, we add an extra praise for God. So the Tziv says that's completely opposite to how we would function at this moment. He describes that actually those 2 descriptions are talking about the problem, which is God had to redeem us in 2 different directions, one with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. And he gives the picture that you can assume that, let's say, a strong person has a bird that you need to get back that is stuck in their hand. On the one hand, you want with force to speak against this enemy, but you need to do it really swiftly and really interesting because the bird is stuck in that cage, and you need to somehow, with an outstretched arm, gather them while also it requires surgical precision. And the Jews at this point are struggling in this way because the Jews were really stuck in Egypt at that point. Some of them didn't even get redeemed because they really, in some way, wanted to stay. And it's actually describing that the Jews were so stuck in Egypt that God needed to not only show a strong arm, he had to very specifically guide us and train us to be the people who are going to eat matzah by that morning. So, and almost every single paragraph that as the Netziv goes through the entire Haggadah, which we don't have the time to go through the whole night, but as he's reading through all of this, what he's describing is both how hard the exile was in Egypt, and then how miraculous, how unexpected, how immediate, and swiftly the redemption came afterwards. And therefore, we too go through these activities so that we can also think that tonight, at least on that very night, on the 15th of Nisan, to think that maybe that morning, redemption will come in the morning, the same way that they had matzah that night. We have this matzah to always have the exact same feelings. And so hopefully my bracha is that we should have the ability to have that Shavach v'Hodah, that we should be able to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all these things happening, just as we do, and that when we experience this Haggadah, and when we ask people that we should come and have a Carbon Pesach, we really do mean that L'Shana Haba, that next year we're inviting you to have a Carbon Pesach with us. I'm not sure when we need to switch to the next speaker, but do we have moments for any questions?
Yes, we have about 4 or 5 minutes for questions. An interesting background question someone just asked, which is highly appropriate given the topic of tonight's conversation. Can you please tell us a little bit more about Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, aka the Netziv of Volozhin, to whom you referred a lot tonight?
I don't know. What can I tell you more about him? He has an incredible amount of Perushim. His commentaries on the Torah, as well as the Mechilta, are kind of legendary. People might be more familiar. I believe his grandson is Meir Bar Ilan, which might have gone to the whole Bar Ilan system, is named from Berlin that got to Bar Ilan in some form.
And Rabbi Chaim Berlin is the other half of that family, the yeshiva in Brooklyn.
Yes, and we get, anyway, we can go through the whole family tree. The Aruch HaShulchan ends up being his second father-in-law. He gets married 3 times. I don't know, I have very random facts. I remember very specifically hearing about an inappropriate joke that was made to him during a perm spiel in Volozhin. and how he retorted in some really strong way, again with halachic understanding, which has to do with about the halachos of trephos, about when you can tell an animal might be dying throughout the year in some form, about whether or not you could or couldn't check the tongue for that, and then a Yiddishism. Point is, the Netziv very often is a person who seems to love Torah, and his mind was processing things at a rate and with a difficulty that you have to kind of follow him a few steps to get to the point of the meaning he's getting to, which was our goal tonight. And he has a gutta with his parish of the Imre Shefer that is available to find. I'm not sure there's an English translation of it anywhere.
We'll have to work on that for next year.
Yeah.
I'll ask a follow-up question. I've thought a lot about this idea of Pesach Mitzrayim, the Seder that took place on that first night, the archetypical Seder, if you will, Pesach Lidorot, the Passover of the generations that follows, that we all continue to reenact, the similarities, the differences. Can you share with us, as we think about the arc of Jewish history and where we find ourselves tonight in 2024, what gives you hope? What do you look forward to thinking about on your Seder as you lead your community in Oakland this year?
The thing that I love about being in Judaism, the thing about being a Jewish person is to remember the entire arc of history, to appreciate not just that we're talking about a Seder that happened 3,500 years ago, but the Seder that happened year after year after year for the last 3,500 years. And so any moment that we think that we're in some dark night, it's impossible to really not compare and realize that there's been way darker nights before. And while there's a great deal of reason to be in mourning and a great deal to be hurt in these days, there's probably more Jews that are going to be celebrating the Seder this year than there ever have been in Jewish history. There's going to be the fact that we have so many people on the Zoom room learning Torah from all around the world. It's as dark as maybe this year of 2024 might be, to really appreciate how long the arc of the Jewish people are and where we are heading, that we do have a land of Israel, that we do have thinking about bringing in Carbon Pesach next year. It's right, the Netziv is right in the 1800s, before we even return to Eretz Yisrael. The idea that we might get a mikdash, he's thinking about it in the 1800s as a possibility.
He's wrestling with the Tsar,
right? And we're so much considering how much ahead of the game we are. I just always hit with a certain sense of optimism, but that might just be me. I might be too overly optimistic. But I do think that the way that a lot of these rules are made was, right, 2,000 years ago, they wrote this idea that maybe next year. And we've been saying that for 2,000 years. And whether that means that we don't, I don't know, part of you thinks that, therefore, well, is it going to happen this year? It didn't happen the last 2,000 times we said it. But I'll tell you this much. We've been able to say the exact same thing about maybe next year for 2,000 years. And I can certainly guarantee we'll be able to say that for the next 2,000 years. And I can feel very confident saying that.
Amen, amen. I think that's a great way for us to end tonight, with a sense of both realism that this is a complicated time, and also optimism that our people have been through complicated moments in the past. We have survived. We have thrived. We find ourselves with opportunities to learn, to celebrate, and to continue to celebrate, and to continue to observe our Jewish tradition in new places and in new ways, and with a sense of connection to ancient tradition at the same time. So, Rav Shua, thank you for sharing all of that with us. I really appreciate, as I said, your take on text and your sense of connection to our tradition, which is so powerful, especially as you think about Chag Pesach, which brings us back to the very beginning of our tradition, of course, to the first mitzvot of our people.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was such an honor to be able to learn with everyone tonight.
Thank you, Rav Shua. Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and I'll thank our first interpreter, Mark, who is going to be moving off, and we'll move over to Rocky, who's been doing our closed captioning. Thank you, all the people in the background making this happen.